the storm is coming, but what the girl finds on the deserted beach is more terrifying than the wrath of the sea. The wind howled through the narrow alleys of the town, slipping between the wooden shacks. A storm was coming. Everyone could smell it, taste the salt, heavy air. The fishermen had pulled in their boats hours ago, tying them down with hands worn and steady from years of bracing against the sea's temper. But Nora remained at her workshop, as she always did. The small building clung to the edge of the harbor, its wood darkened from decades of salt spray and weather-beaten seasons. Inside, it smelled of damp rope, varnish, and the faint metallic tang of rusting nails. A lantern flickered on her workbench, its light swaying with the wind that slipped through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the waves crashed against the pier, their rhythm shifting, becoming unpredictable, uneasy. She ignored it. She hammered a new plank onto a dory's hull. Tap, tap. A pause to adjust the angle, another tap. The sound, steady and precise, had become a kind of heartbeat in her solitude. She preferred the sound of wood and metal over the forced pleasantries in the town. The storm had yet to fully arrive, but its whispers crawled under her skin. She reached for another nail just as a gust rattled the window shutters. The air smelled heavier now. More rain, more wind. A dull sound cut through the wind, a deep, hollow knock against wood. At first, she thought it was just the boats shifting at the dock. Then it came again, closer this time. Thud. She straightened, narrowing her eyes at the darkened coastline beyond her workshop. The ocean stretched out like an endless shadow, its surface a restless, shifting thing. The tide had dragged something in. She pulled her coat over her shoulders, pushing the door open against the wind. The cold bit at her face, and the rain hit her in sharp. The shore was nothing but a smear of wet sand and jagged rocks, the surf clawing hungrily at whatever it could reach. Then she saw it. A small boat rocked in the shallows, half filled with water, its bow dipping as each wave threatened to pull it back to sea. It was barely intact, splintered along one side, its oars gone. No markings, no sign of where it had come from. Nora hesitated. The last time a wreck washed up here, it had been nothing more than a fisherman's lost skiff, long abandoned. But something about this felt different. She stepped forward, her boots sinking into the wet sand. As she reached the boat, her pulse slowed, an unease settling in her chest. Inside, curled in the corner like a forgotten piece of driftwood, was a child, a boy. His small frame was drenched, his clothes clinging to his skin. His breath was barely visible in the cold air. Strands of dark, wet hair stuck to his forehead, his face pale, lips almost blue. She crouched beside the boat, her hand hovering before she finally pressed 2 fingers against his throat. A heartbeat, slow but steady. "Hey," she said, shaking his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" No response. The tide was creeping in, licking at the edge of the boat. She didn't have time to think. Bracing herself, she reached in and lifted him. He too thin, his limbs limp against her as she carried him across the uneven sand. The storm, sensing her urgency, seemed to pick up its pace, pushing against her, throwing rain into her eyes. By the time she made it back to the workshop, her arms ached, but she didn't stop. Kicking the door shut behind her, she laid the boy on a work table, brushing wet hair away from his forehead. His skin was cold to the touch. She needed to warm him. Fast, shrugging off her coat, she grabbed a blanket from a crate and wrapped it around him. He barely moved. His chest rose and fell, but faintly. Her hands worked on instinct. She stoked the fire in the small cast-iron stove, pouring water into a dented kettle. The storm rattled the windows, but she ignored it. He needed dry clothes, warmth. She fumbled through a trunk in the corner, pulling out an old woolen shirt and tattered pants. They'd be too big for him, but they'd do. As she worked to remove his wet clothing, her fingers brushed against something cool at his collarbone. A necklace. A thin silver chain, half hidden beneath the soaked fabric. At its center hung a small pendant, worn with age, a single letter engraved into the metal. F. She exhaled sharply, her breath unsteady. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Who are you?" she muttered. She had seen plenty of castaways in her lifetime, fishermen who miscalculated a storm, drifters who lost their way, but a child, Alone in a broken boat with nothing but a name reduced to a letter, she pulled a chair closer to the table and sat down, watching the firelight flicker across his still face. His breathing was deeper, the color in his lips returning. Good. Nora wasn't one for prayer, but she hoped he'd wake up soon. The storm outside reached its full fury, slamming against the walls of the workshop. But inside, by the glow of the fire, the boy slept on, the silver chain glinting softly against his skin. And for the first time in years, Nora found herself waiting for something. The fire in the cast-iron stove flickered weakly, its glow stretching and shrinking across the wooden walls of the workshop. The wind still howled beyond the thin walls of the workshop. The wind still howled beyond the thin walls, rattling the window panes as if demanding to be let in. Rain drummed against the roof in an unsteady rhythm, a sharp contrast to the measured rise and fall of Nora's breath as she crouched beside the work table, watching the boy. He barely moved. The thick blankets she had wrapped him in swallowed his small frame, but they did little to stop the shivers that rippled through him. His skin was still too pale, his lips slightly parted as though he were trying to form words that never came. Every so often he made a small "Nora," reached for a cloth, dipping it into a basin of warm water before pressing it gently to his forehead. Fever, likely from the hours spent out on the water, his body battered by the cold. She pulled the blanket tighter around him, then sat back, arms resting on her knees. This wasn't the first time she had cared for a lost soul. The sea had a habit of returning things it had no use for: driftwood, shattered hulls, and sometimes people. But this was different. A child. Nora exhaled, glancing toward the small kettle on the stove. The scent of steeping tea drifted through the workshop, cutting through the lingering dampness. She stood, moving with practiced ease as she poured the tea into a tin cup. The steam curled upward, delicate and fleeting. Nora's fingers twitched with the urge to wake him, to press for answers, but what would be the point? He was barely holding on to consciousness. Instead, she settled into the worn chair beside the table, her hands wrapping around the warm tin cup. The tea was bitter, but it steadied her. The storm raged on outside, its winds shrieking against the coastline. She listened to it, finding a rhythm in the chaos. The boy stirred, at first just a small twitch of his fingers, then his brow furrowed, lips parting as he mumbled something unintelligible. Nora leaned forward. His voice was hoarse, broken by sleep and fever. "No. Don't, please." Her stomach tightened, the kind of pleading that came from something deeper than a bad dream. She reached out, resting a hand lightly on his arm, the way one might calm a skittish animal. "You're safe," she said quietly. "It's all right." His eyelids fluttered, but his breathing stayed uneven. Whatever haunted him, it wasn't letting go so easily. She waited, listening to the storm inside him as much as the one outside. The night stretched on, slow and heavy. Nora found herself watching his every breath, every tremor. He was still fighting something in his sleep, but little by little, his face lost its tension. The fever still clung to him, but the shivering had lessened. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Outside, the wind began to change, losing some of its earlier fury. The worst of the storm had passed. Nora took another sip of tea, her gaze drifting back to the boy. She had no idea what she had just pulled from the sea. But one thing was certain: whoever he was, wherever he came from, she had a feeling that neither of them would be the same by the time he remembered. The workshop was quiet, save for the steady crackle of the fire. Outside, the storm had passed, but the remnants of its fury still lingered. The occasional gust of wind rattled the window panes, and rainwater dripped steadily from the roof onto the wooden planks outside. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt, damp wool, and the faint aroma of chamomile from the tea Nora had set beside the boy. Finn stirred again, his breath coming in uneven gasps, his small frame trembling beneath the heavy blanket. Nora sat nearby, silent, watching. She leaned in, her voice low. "You're safe." The boy jerked awake, eyes wide, pupils blown with panic. He gasped, his chest rising and falling too fast, his body recoiling as if expecting someone, to strike him. His breathing slowed, though his hands still clutched the blanket as if it might disappear. After a moment, his gaze found hers, and for the first time, he seemed to truly register where he was. "You're all right," she said again, softer this time. "You're in my workshop. I found you in the storm." Finn blinked, his fingers ghosting over his own arms, as if checking that he was still real. Slowly, his shoulders dropped, the tension seeping from his small frame like water escaping from cracked wood. "Do you remember anything?" Nora asked. Finn frowned, his brows knitting together. His hand drifted to his throat, fingers tracing the cool metal of the necklace. He clutched it tightly, his knuckles whitening. "Salt!" he whispered. His voice was hoarse, barely audible. Nora waited. "The waves!" Finn continued, hesitating, as if the memories were just out of reach. "A ship. A big one." Nora didn't speak. She knew silence could be gentler than pressing for answers. Finn swallowed, his throat bobbing. "Someone was yelling. I think—" He closed his eyes, frustration flickering across his features. I don't know. It's like a fog. It's there, but I can't hold on to it." His hands balled into fists, his breath quickening again. Nora reached for the tea, her movements unhurried. "Drink this," she said, offering him the cup. "It'll help." Finn hesitated before taking it. The ceramic was warm against his fingers, grounding. He lifted it to his lips, taking a tentative sip. The tension in his shoulders lessened slightly. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, filling the silence. 10, maybe? He had a sharpness to his features, though his face still held the softness. His hair, now dry, was a dark brown that curled slightly at the ends. His blue eyes, even dulled by exhaustion, were bright. "Finn," she murmured, glancing at the necklace. "Finn." His head lifted. "That's my name," he said, as if only now realizing it. Nora nodded. "It's a good one." Finn stared down at the tea in his hands. "You think someone's looking for me?" His voice was quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. Nora didn't lie. Maybe. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. He nodded but said nothing more. That night, as Finn slept, the murmurs returned. Nora stayed up, sitting by the fire, working on a torn fishing net. The rhythmic motion of threading the rope helped her think. Finn stirred, his breaths coming quicker, his body shifting restlessly beneath the blanket. His fingers twitched, clutching at something invisible. Then he spoke. "Don't." A sharp inhale. "No, please." Nora set the net down. Finn's breathing hitched. "Stop. No." His voice cracked. A name slipped from his lips. It was faint, almost swallowed by the sound of the wind outside. She leaned in. "Finn," she called gently. His face scrunched in distress. They're still on the boat," he choked out. A chill crawled up her spine. Before she could say anything else, Finn's eyes flew open, his breath ragged. For a long moment he just lay there, blinking at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling too fast. Nora spoke carefully. "You were dreaming." His fingers finding the necklace again, he exhaled shakily. I think people were with me." His voice was fragile, as if the words might shatter in his throat. Nora nodded, giving him time. Finn's brows furrowed. "I don't know if they're okay." She had seen the sea take more than its fair share, but she also knew there were some losses that didn't settle until you had answers. "We'll find out," she said simply. Finn looked at her then, searching her face for something, and for the first time, some of the fear in his gaze lessened. The morning air carried the scent of salt and damp wood, a crisp reminder of the tides that ruled this town. The docks groaned under the weight of fishermen loading their gear, their voices a low murmur against the rhythmic slap of waves. Finn stood beside Nora, his fingers tracing the rough edge of a wooden hull she had him sanding down. Nora introduces him to the slow, repetitive work of repairing fishing boats. She tells stories of the sea, passing down knowledge from her grandfather. Finn listens intently, drawn to the ocean but also fearful. The atmosphere is filled with the steady sound of waves and wooden boats creaking at the dock. Nora decides to let Finn stay with her. She teaches him how to mend torn sails and patch wooden hulls. As the days pass, their bond grows, built on quiet moments and shared tasks. At night, by the flickering lantern in the workshop, Nora tells Finn about shipwrecks, mythical sea creatures. Finn, though hesitant at first, begins to feel a sense of belonging he has never known before. Finn begins adjusting to life in the town. The ocean fascinated him, its vastness, its restlessness, but he never ventured too close. Even now, his bare feet stayed just shy of the tide's reach. "You ever go out there?" he asked, nodding toward the open sea. "Used to," Nora replied. "Not anymore." He had learned quickly that Nora was a woman of few words, that her answers often led to more silence than explanations, but he liked that about her. She let the world settle between sentences, never forcing it into shape with unnecessary words. The two of them worked in unspoken rhythm until Caleb shuffled down the dock, his gait uneven from an old injury. He was one of the few fishermen who still spoke to Nora regularly, not out of necessity but familiarity. Not out of necessity but familiar. "Morning," he greeted, eyeing Finn before spitting over the dock's edge. "Boys settling in, I see." Nora gave a small nod. "He's learning." Finn kept his head down, focused on his work, but he felt Caleb's gaze linger. The old man exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. "You hear the news?" Caleb asked, shifting his attention to Nora. "That cruise ship, one that went missing. Radio's been talking about it all morning." Nora wiped her hands on a rag, her expression unreadable. "That's so, aye. Few survivors washed up miles south. Said the ship went under, fast." Caleb scratched his chin. "Reckon they'll be looking for more." Something in Finn's chest tightened. He kept sanding, but his grip on the wood stiffened. Caleb noticed. His eyes, sharp despite his years, narrowed slightly. "Where'd you say the boy's from again?" "I didn't," Nora answered simply. A pause stretched between them. Then Caleb huffed a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, you always did have a habit of taking in strays." With that, he turned and made his way back toward the town. Finn exhaled slowly, his shoulders still tense. Nora didn't look at him when she spoke next. "People talk," she said. "Let them." Finn swallowed. "What if they find out?" "Then they find out," she said. "But until then, we work." She tossed him another piece of sandpaper and he caught it. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the first hints of the storm Caleb had warned about. Finn glanced toward the sea one last time before lowering his head and returning to his task, the slow scrape of sandpaper against wood filling the silence between them. A radio broadcast in town discusses a missing cruise ship. Finn's reaction is subtle but telling. His hands clench, his breathing shifts. Nora watches him, but doesn't press. She instead seeks information from Caleb, an old fisherman who knows the sea better than anyone. Caleb, who used to be a captain, has been working the sea for 60 years. There is no place he has not seen. When he looked at Finn, he was startled to say that he looked exactly like the son of James Carver, a wealthy businessman who owned the largest fleet of cruise ships in the area. The conversation with Caleb lingered in her mind, each word pressing against her ribs like the weight of the tide. James Carver. She had heard the name before. Even in a town as isolated as this, whispers of wealth and power found their way through the cracks. A man like Carver had no business here, no reason to be spoken of, unless something had gone terribly wrong. Behind her, Finn sat on an overturned crate, threading fishing line through his fingers. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if grounding himself in the texture of the twine. He hadn't asked questions, but she shift in Nora's demeanor had been enough. "You're thinking about it," he said quietly. Nora exhaled, letting the rope slip through her hands. "I don't know what you mean." The words hung between them, fragile as glass. A gull shrieked overhead, diving toward the waves. "I don't owe him anything," Nora said finally. "And neither do you." Finn set the fishing line aside. He was still so young, she thought, but there was something in his eyes that didn't belong to a child. A quiet, weary knowing. That was the part that gnawed at her. This town had a way of keeping its own secrets, but not forever. Caleb wouldn't talk, not outright, but words had a way of drifting like sea foam, carried by idle conversations and knowing glances. And James Carver, a man like that, didn't wait for answers. Nora rubbed a hand over her face. You don't understand what people like him are capable of. I know enough, Finn said, his fingers tightened around the edge of the crate. And I know you don't trust him. She let out a slow breath. No, she admitted. I don't. The dock creaked beneath her boots as she turned toward the sea. The horizon stretched out, endless and indifferent. Somewhere out there was a past Finn had forgotten, a life he had been torn from. It wasn't her place to decide whether he belonged to it or not, but she could decide how he got there. Nora? She looked back at him. He wasn't pleading, wasn't afraid, just waiting. She gave a short nod. All right. Finn blinked. All right? Finn didn't argue. He just nodded and went back to his fishing line, but the tension in his shoulders eased, just slightly. The next morning, as the tide went out, the distant hum of a rotor engine cut through the silence. Fishing boats, gently swaying in the harbor, swayed under the force of the oncoming wind. A shadow passed over the dock, the unmistakable silhouette of a sleek black helicopter hovering over the deserted beach just beyond the edge of town. Nora stood by the open door of the workshop, her fingers curling around the edge of the workbench. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, it weighed on her chest like an immovable weight. Finn stood beside her, shoulders stiff, his gaze locked on the machine as it hit the ground. His hands jerked at his sides, unsure whether to hold on or run. He had spent the morning trying not to question it, but now, faced with the reality, he felt unsettled. You don't have to go, Nora said, her voice low. Finn glanced at her. She didn't look at him, but he heard something rare in her voice, hesitation, uncertainty. I think so, he whispered. The helicopter engine whirred, the rotors slowing, sand swirled, a thin layer of mist covering the beach. Then the door opened. The man who stepped out didn't belong. James Carver, tall, well-dressed. His sharp gaze swept the town, then settled on Finn. No rush forward, no outstretched arms. Nora stiffened. James crossed the sand with a steady stride, his polished boots barely leaving a mark on the wet ground. The town fell quiet. The sounds of work and distant conversation fading to whispers. A few fishermen paused, watching, not interfering, but watching. Finn felt like something small. James stopped a few feet away. He looked at the boy, tilting his head slightly. You're a big boy, he said. His voice was soft. Finn blinked. There was nothing in the man's face that suggested warmth. He wasn't even sure if James was happy to see him or just acknowledging that he was alive. I don't remember you, Finn admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. James smiled, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. It's okay. You're home now. A muscle in Nora's jaw tightened. He is? She asked, her voice even but firm. James turned his attention back to her, finally acknowledging her presence. His gaze swept over her ragged clothes, the oil stains on her hands. His expression was polite but distant. I appreciate what you did, he said, but this is my child. Nora didn't move, didn't blink. Finn isn't something to be messed with. For the first time, James hesitated, as if he didn't expect an answer. He let the silence drag on before continuing. Finn took a deep breath. The words sounded foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. The moment stretched. Then James stepped aside and gestured toward the helicopter. We should go. Finn looked between the man who called himself his father and the woman who had taught him how to mend broken wood, how to listen to the wind, how to stand firm. His heart was beating too fast, his mind screaming blank. Nora didn't stop him. She didn't say his name. She just stood there, watching, waiting, letting him decide. After a long moment, Finn swallowed and took a step forward. Then another. And another. He climbed into the helicopter without looking back. James followed, the door slamming behind them with a heavy thud. As the plane lifted off, sending swirls of wind across the sand, Nora stood still, motionless. The villagers turned away, returning to their work, the moment slipping into the past as if it had never happened. Nora, though she has no right to keep Finn, gives him a small compass she made herself, as a promise that he can always find his way back. The silence inside the helicopter was oppressive. Finn sat stiffly, his hands pressed into his thighs, the rumble of the engine vibrating through his bones. James sat across from him, reading something on his phone, his posture detached. as if this were just another business transaction neatly wrapped up. Finn's fingers tightened on the fabric of his pants. His stomach clenched. He was leaving, just like that. Nora didn't stop him, but she didn't tell him to go either. He turned his head, watching the shore disappear below them. The sea stretched out endlessly, indifferent to his departure. The grand entrance hall sparkled under the chandeliers, the air thick with something artificial, too clean, too still. Finn stepped hesitantly inside, his boots scraping against the marble floor. A woman hurried over before he could get a better look, the housekeeper who had worked for Finn's family since his mother died. Finn followed her down a long hallway lined with paintings he didn't recognize. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive linen. The dinner was quiet, restrained. A table for 20, now 2. Finn pushed his plate around, the weight of expectation weighing heavily on his shoulders. "You're starting tutoring next week," James said. "You've missed out on proper schooling." Finn didn't answer. James continued, unfazed. "We'll do some press interviews." "They'll want a statement." Finn looked up. "A statement?" "To announce your return," James said. He had been home less than a day and already he felt like a chess piece placed on a board. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the moonlight streaming through the large windows. Everything here was too soft, too quiet. He missed the sound of waves lapping at the shore in the distance, the creak of wood in Nora's workshop, the smell of salt in his clothes. His fingers touched his pockets. He pulled out a small object from inside. The compass Nora had given him before he left. The metal was cool in his hand, familiar in a way this house never would be. He turned it over, watching the needle wobble before settling on north. A whisper of wind hit the glass. He closed his fingers around the compass. He wasn't sure which way north was anymore. The mansion was vast, but Finn had never felt smaller. Days passed in a blur of carefully controlled routines. Tutors arrived in the mornings, their voices echoing in the cavernous study rooms. Meals were served on polished silver, each dinner conversation orchestrated by James, who spoke as if Finn were an investment to be managed, rather than a son returned from the dead. At night, Finn lay awake in the unfamiliar silence, gripping the compass Nora had given him, listening to the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. The weight of the house pressed in on him. He felt like a ghost haunting a life he didn't remember. The house was silent, suffocatingly so. Shadows stretched long across the marble floors, shifting with the flickering glow of dim sconces. The night was thick with an unsettling stillness, the kind that made the air feel heavier, as if something unseen lurked just beyond the light. Then, a whisper. It cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and barely audible. Finn froze mid-step, his bare feet gripping the cold marble. His pulse quickened. He had spent the past few weeks mastering the art of moving unnoticed, learning which boards creaked, which corners to avoid. But now, standing at the edge of the grand staircase, the voices slithering up from below made his breath hitch in his throat. James. His father's voice, low, clipped, deliberate, the same voice Finn had heard giving orders on the sinking ship. Another voice responded, deeper, urgent, laced with tension. Finn edged closer, his heartbeat pounding in his ears as he pressed himself into the shadow of the staircase, straining to hear. "The press is still asking questions," the man was saying. "The survivors, some of them are starting to talk." Finn's stomach lurched, his breath caught in his throat. Survivors. His fingers dug into the polished wooden railing. He barely registered the cold sweat prickling his skin. James's reply was swift, controlled. "They don't have proof." A long, heavy silence where Finn could almost hear the weight of the words before they were spoken. Then the other man's voice came again, lower now, but with an unmistakable edge. "They don't need proof, just the right words in the right ears. If this gets out..." A sharp sound, glass meeting glass, the clink of ice shifting inside a tumbler. Then James spoke, quieter this time, almost bored. "They won't." The finality in his tone sent a chill down Finn's spine. His fingers trembled as he gripped the railing tighter. His mind reeled, flashes of memories slamming into him. The screams, the cold black water swallowing everything. His father standing there watching it all happen. Finn stumbled back a step, his breath shaky, the floor creaked, the voices stopped. A beat of silence. Then, movement. A chair scraping against the floor, footsteps, headed straight for the door. Finn's body acted before his mind caught up. He turned and ran, silent, swift, darting through the corridors he had come to know in the dark. His breath came in sharp bursts, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He didn't stop moving until he reached his room, slamming the door shut behind him, his back pressed against the cold wood. His hands shook. He couldn't slow his breathing. James was covering it up. He was making sure no one knew, and if Finn stayed here any longer, if his father so much as suspected what he had overheard, Finn knew exactly what would happen. He had to get out. Now. Finn didn't move. Didn't breathe. His body was rigid, every nerve on high alert as he... Then, the unmistakable clink of ice against glass. James exhaled slowly, like he was bored, like the entire conversation was just another routine problem to be smoothed over. They won't. His voice dipped lower, quieter now. Because we will ensure they don't. Finn's stomach twisted, the weight of the words pressing down on him like an anchor dragging him into the abyss. The ship, the one that had gone down, the one he had been on. James. He wasn't just covering it up, he was erasing it. Finn's breath quickened, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. The heat of the moment made his skin prickle, the pulsing in his ears deafening. He could see it all again, the flashes of fire against black water, the distant cries swallowed by the crashing waves. The helpless hands reaching, and James standing on the deck watching, and then turning away. Finn took a step back, instinct kicking in before reason could stop him. Creak. His blood turned to ice. The voices inside the office stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then a chair scraping against the floor. The shuffle of movement. Someone heading toward the door. Shit. Finn turned and ran. Not an all-out sprint. He had learned how to move silently in this house. Quick, controlled steps, keeping to the edges of the hallway. His heart pounded against his ribs, a relentless drumbeat. Behind him the door opened. Finn didn't dare look back. He slipped into the nearest corridor, pressing himself into the shadows just as footsteps spilled into the hallway. James's voice was calm, but beneath it was something new, something sharp. Check the hall. Finn clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay still, to shrink into the darkness. His lungs burned from the effort of keeping his breaths quiet. A second voice. The other man. You think someone heard? James didn't answer right away. The hairs on Finn's neck rose. He had heard that tone before. It was the same one his father had used when deciding whether something, or someone, was an inconvenience. He had to get out. Now. The footsteps were moving, searching. Finn slipped further into the darkness, his mind racing. He needed a way out, a plan, something, anything. Then, another voice, distant, a maid, humming as she walked through an adjacent hall. A distraction. It was all he needed. Finn moved, swift and silent, slipping down a narrow servants' passage, weaving through the corridors like a ghost. His feet barely touched the ground as he climbed the back stairwell 2 steps at a time. His door was in sight now, almost there. He reached for the handle, slid inside and shut it behind him without a sound. Only when the lock clicked into place did he finally let himself breathe. His hands trembled as he pressed his back against the door. The weight of what he had just overheard crushed into him. James was covering up the wreck. James was silencing people, and if Finn wasn't careful, he'd be next. Finn's heart slammed a relentless hammering that drowned out everything else. The ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint rustling of the wind outside, the distant hum of the ocean. His pulse roared in his ears, deafening, consuming. His breath came fast, uneven. He curled his fingers into his hair, pressing his palms against his temples as if he could squeeze the memories into focus, force them to make sense. But the past didn't return gently. It came in jagged, violent flashes, black water swallowing metal, a monstrous wave crashing over the deck, the ship lurching, splitting, the sound of steel tearing apart like an animal's dying scream. The fire. It bloomed against the sky, an unnatural orange glow against the endless dark of the storm. The wind had carried the acrid scent of burning oil, of melting plastic, of something worse. The kind of smell that never leaves your skin no matter how hard you scrub. Then, the screams. So many voices, crying, begging, pleading for help that would never come. Finn's body tensed, his muscles locking, his throat tightening as if the edges were still blurred, fractured, but the truth was there. James had abandoned them. He had chosen who got to live and who got to die, and Finn hadn't been meant to survive. A shudder rippled through him, and his grip on the compass tightened. The metal was warm from where he had held it, the needle trembling as if sensing his thoughts, his fear. His father wouldn't stop. He wouldn't let this story get out. He would bury it, drown it beneath money and silence, just like he had done to the people on that ship. Just like he had tried to do to Finn. A sick feeling twisted in his stomach. He wasn't safe here. James thought he was weak, lost, easy to control. He was wrong. Finn forced himself to his feet. His legs felt shaky, but his mind was clearer now. The truth was no longer just a whisper in the back of his mind. It was a roaring storm. He had to get out. Not tomorrow, not when it was convenient. Now. Before James realized he knew the truth. Before the walls of this golden prison closed in around him forever. And more than that, he had to go back. To the only place that had ever felt real. To the only person he knew he could trust. To Nora. The rain had started before dawn, creeping in like a whisper, soaking the cobblestone streets and turning the world into a blur of mist and shadow. The town still slumbered, unaware, untouched by the quiet storm rolling in from the sea. Beyond the jagged cliffs, the ocean stretched out like an open wound, black, restless, endless. The faint, rhythmic pulse of the lighthouse flickered against the dark, swallowed almost instantly by the thick curtain of rain. Nora had been awake long before the first drops fell. She sat on the dock, fingers working through the damp, tangled nets she had left out the night before. The storm had made a mess of them, twisting the ropes into something almost unsalvageable. But she was patient. She always had been. Her hands moved with practiced precision, weaving, unknotting, pulling. The rhythmic repetition was calming, a habit formed over years of solitude. But tonight the air felt wrong, heavy, like something was pressing against the edges of the horizon, waiting to make itself known. She paused, listened. The only sounds were the soft patter of rain against wood, the distant clang of a buoy rocking in the relentless tide. Nothing unusual. Yet the feeling didn't leave her. If anything, it intensified, curling at the back of her mind like a warning. Then, a sound. Barely there, soft, faint, unsteady. Footsteps dragging, slow. Nora's spine stiffened. Her grip on the rope tightened instinctively as she turned, her sharp eyes scanning the rain-blurred edges of the dock. A shape moved in the mist. A figure, staggering, collapsing. For half a second, the world seemed to tilt. A rush of recognition hit her like a wave crashing over the shore. Finn, soaked to the bone. Barefoot, shaking. His clothes clung to his body, torn and stained with something darker than seawater. He took another step forward, then his knees buckled. Nora was already moving before she could think. She reached him just as he crumpled, her arms catching his thin frame before he hit the soaked wood of the dock. His body was ice cold, far too light. His breathing came in sharp, ragged gasps, his fingers curling weakly into the fabric of her coat as though trying to hold on. "Finn," she murmured, crouching low, steadying him against her, his head lolled forward, his damp hair clinging to his forehead. Barely conscious, her stomach twisted. "What the hell happened to you?" No response, just a weak, shuddering inhale, but she already knew. Somehow, she already knew. The storm wasn't the only thing that had arrived tonight, and it wasn't finished yet. A figure emerged from the mist, drenched, shoulders hunched with cold. His clothes were ragged, his face pale with streaks of rain and salt. Finn. Nora dropped her net and stepped forward, but he reached her first, staggering against her before he could stop. His fingers clenched the front of her coat, clutching the fabric with the last of his strength. He was shaking, "Nora," he said hoarsely, his voice hoarse from the wind and exhaustion. She caught him before he fell, steadying him with strong arms. "I'm freezing," she muttered, already pulling him toward the workshop. "What the hell happened?" He didn't answer, not yet. His breathing was short and shallow, and his limbs felt boneless and spent. But he didn't let her go, as if afraid that if he did, he would disappear again. The crackling firelight flickered against the window, and for a moment he could almost see the reflection of flames on dark water. He swallowed hard. He let them die. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the words cut through the silence like a blade. He knew the ship was going down, and he left them there. He ordered the lifeboats to leave, half empty, so he could save himself, his money, his name. He didn't care about them. Not any of them. Nora's fingers flexed slightly, her only sign of movement. Her expression remained unreadable, but Finn could feel the way her entire body had tensed, as if bracing for something she couldn't see. "And you?" she asked, voice steady but edged with something Finn couldn't quite place. "How did you survive?" Finn's grip on the compass in his hand tightened until his knuckles turned white. The metal was warm, damp from his palm, an anchor against the storm in his head. He hesitated. The truth felt like a living thing inside his chest, twisting, clawing its way out. "He put me in that boat," Finn said finally, voice shaking. "Not to save me, to silence me." The words landed heavy, heavier than the rain against the wooden roof. Finn's breathing was uneven now, his ribs tight with the weight of the memory. "He looked right at me," Finn continued, his voice quieter but no less fierce. "Right before they lowered the boat, I begged him. I said there were still people on board, that we had to help them. He didn't even flinch, just turned away. And then they cut the ropes, and I was adrift." His throat felt raw, like he had swallowed seawater all over again. Nora exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible over the storm. "And now he's making sure no one ever finds out." Finn nodded. "I heard him," he said, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "He's covering it up, paying people off, threatening the ones who survived. If I go back, if he finds me, he won't stop. He can't let me talk." Nora leaned back against the wall, exhaling through her nose. The tension in her shoulders was heavy, palpable. Finn didn't know what she was thinking. She was always hard to read. But he could tell one thing for certain. She believed him. A gust of wind slammed against the walls, rattling the shutters. The fire crackled, its glow casting long shadows across the room. The weight of Finn's words sat between them like a storm cloud, dark and unshakable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nora spoke. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Hellboat stopped. Finn swallowed, his heartbeat loud in his ears. "Then what do we do?" He'd seen her like this before. And then, finally, she stood. "Okay," she said simply. "We'll figure it out." Finn blinked. "That's it? You think I'll let him drag you back there?" Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "No way." Something inside him, tight since he'd left, loosened. Then, before either of them could say more, footsteps echoed outside, heavy, purposeful. Finn's stomach dropped. He knew that sound. Nora grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "Stand behind me." The door swung open before she could reach it. James Carver stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat, two men in dark suits standing beside him. The air between them was charged, thick with the weight of unspoken decisions. Finn watched as Nora sat still, unreadable, her fingers flexing against the rough grain of the workbench. He'd seen her like this before, calculating, measuring, waiting for the right move. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she stood. "All right," she said simply, her voice low, unwavering. Finn blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in her tone. "That's it?" She looked at him then, sharp and direct, her eyes dark with something he couldn't quite name. "You think I'd just let him drag you back there?" Her voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. Unyielding, immovable. No way in hell. Something inside Finn, knotted tight since the moment he had stepped onto that helicopter, finally loosened. A breath he hadn't realized he was holding slipped out. She wasn't sending him away. She wasn't hesitating. She was with him. But the relief was fleeting. A sound, footsteps. Not the slow, casual steps of a passing villager, but something heavier, more deliberate, boots against the damp wooden planks outside, the unmistakable rhythm of men with purpose. Finn's stomach clenched like a fist. He knew that sound. Nora reacted instantly, grabbing his arm in one swift motion and yanking him to his feet. Her fingers pressed into his forearm. Strong, grounding. "Behind me," she ordered, her voice barely above a whisper, but firm enough that he obeyed without thinking. The footsteps stopped just beyond the door. Silence. Then the handle turned. Not tentative, not hesitant, a single, forceful motion. The door slammed open before Nora could even take a step toward it. Wind and rain howled in from the storm outside, cold and biting, but the real chill came from the figure standing in the doorway. James Carver. Tall, composed, untouched by the weather, as if the storm itself dared not lay a hand on him. His coat, black and rain-soaked, dripped onto the floor, the droplets spreading in uneven, dark patterns against the wood. His expression was unreadable, his gaze cutting through the dim firelight until it landed on Finn. And beside him, like shadows given form, stood two men, broad, clad in dark suits, their faces impassive. They didn't need to speak. Their presence was enough. Finn felt his heartbeat slam against his ribs. James took a single step inside, slow, measured, owning the space the second he entered. "Let's not make this difficult," he said, his voice as smooth as glass, as sharp as the edge of a knife. His eyes flicked to Nora, appraising her, as if she were a mere obstacle, a temporary inconvenience. "You've had your fun playing protector," James continued, his tone almost casual. "But it's time for the boy to come home." Nora didn't move, didn't blink. Then, in the slowest, most deliberate motion, she shifted her weight, her stance going from neutral to ready. A single movement, barely perceptible, but Finn recognized it instantly. She was preparing for a fight. The air inside the workshop had shifted, thick and suffocating, charged with something electric. The fire crackled in the corner, but its warmth did nothing to chase away the cold creeping into Finn's bones. His father stood just inside the threshold, his presence commanding, filling the space with something sharp and unnatural. His polished exterior unshaken by the storm raging outside. His eyes swept over the dimly lit room, scanning, calculating, before settling on Finn. "I suggest you come quietly." His voice was soft, too soft, a carefully measured whisper of a threat wrapped in civility, as if this were nothing more than a business transaction. Finn's breath stuttered. His pulse roared in his ears, his hands cold despite the heat of the nearby fire. Nora didn't move, didn't flinch. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice even, her body unnaturally still. But Finn could see it, the shift in her stance, the way her fingers flexed slightly at her sides. She was waiting, calculating. James sighed, a slow exhale feigning patience. "Let's not make a fuss." Nora's eyes darkened. "You already did." Then, outside, a sound, footsteps, slow, hesitant, and then whispers. The town was waking up. Finn's stomach twisted. They were listening. James heard it too. His jaw twitched, irritation flickering through the carefully constructed mask he wore. "Finn belongs with his family." His voice was firmer now, but he hadn't raised it. He didn't need to. The weight behind his words was enough. Nora tilted her head slightly, studying him, her expression unreadable. Then she said calmly, deliberately, "Are you sure?" The words hung in the air, stretching the silence between them, turning the small workshop into a battlefield of unspoken truths. Finn saw it. The hesitation. The brief flicker in James's gaze. The weight of the town's watchful eyes pressed in from the darkness outside. The storm raged, the waves crashing angrily against the docks, as if the sea itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Then, behind James, the first townspeople appeared at the edge of the dock. A fisherman, then another. "You don't know what you're talking about, Finn," he said, his voice even and patient. "You're confused." Finn clenched his fists, his body tense. "No, I remember," he said, his voice even. "I remember the fire, The way you left everyone behind." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some faces flashed with recognition, others with disbelief. But the doubt in their eyes did not shake Finn. He knew the truth now. James stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, calmly. "I did what I had to do," he said. "The ship is sinking. You're a kid. You don't understand the choices you have to make." Nora came up beside Finn. "You sound like you understand." James ignored her. He kept his eyes on Finn. "It's time to go home." Finn felt the coldness of the words wash over him. Home. The word didn't fit. Maybe it never had. He looked at Nora. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her presence was steady, a beacon against the storm. Finn swallowed, then looked back at James. "I'm not going anywhere with you." James's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "You don't get to make that choice." The men beside him stepped forward. Not a threat, not yet, but almost. Nora exhaled slowly. "I'll think about it," she said. James barely glanced at her. "That's not your concern." "See, that's where you're wrong." She shrugged, relaxed and unconcerned, but her voice still carried a hardness. "Because of this town?" A hush fell over the docks. And then, like a tide turning, people moved. Slowly at first, an old fisherman shifted his stance. A woman crossed her arms. Then more. A tight circle, squeezing in, blocking the exits. James noticed. His jaw twitched. He wasn't used to being challenged, let alone in an anonymous town. He glanced at Finn, as if expecting him to collapse under the weight of his presence. But Finn didn't flinch. Instead, he spoke. Not just to James, to all of them. "I was on that ship," he said, his voice echoing across the water. "I remember those men screaming. The lifeboats leaving half full while the rest of us were left behind. I remember the fire, the rising water, the way they begged." His throat tightened. "And I remember you, standing there, watching, doing nothing." Silence. Then a voice. "Rough, hard, is that right?" James didn't answer. The wind howled through the mast, jerking the sails, whispering through the ropes. Then another voice, this time a woman standing near the front. He was there, my brother. "He didn't make it." A fisherman stepped forward. "My cousin didn't make it either." Voices rang out. Names were spoken. The losses acknowledged. "The ones who never came home." James stammered. "There's no evidence." James took a sharp breath. James turned, a sudden movement toward the men with him. "We're leaving." He stepped back. But the crowd did not part. The sea groaned against the dock, waves crashing against the pilings. The air vibrated with something electric. And then it happened. A roar, wind and water colliding. A huge wave rose suddenly from the black abyss, crashing against the dock. Wood cracked. Water sprayed high, swallowing the planks where James had been standing only minutes ago. Finn's heart pounded. Not with fear, but with something else. It was over. The town stood still, the weight of what had happened seeping into their bones. But no one moved to search the water. No one called for help. James had made his choice, and the sea had made its own. That night, Finn stood at the edge of the harbor, watching the tide rise. The storm had passed, but the waves still carried their whispers, restless even in the silence. Nora stepped up to him, her hands in her pockets. "Are you okay?" Finn turned the compass over in his hands. The needle wobbled, then stopped. "North." "I think so," he said. She nodded. There was no word for a long moment. Then, "You know you don't have to stay here." Finn looked at her. The workshop, the town, the people, the strange, imperfect life he'd found himself in. "I know." He glanced back at the sea. "But I want to." Nora didn't smile, not exactly. But something in her relaxed. "Okay," she said. "I guess we should find you a boat to fix." And just like that, it was settled. The past would always be there. The wreckage, the ghosts, the truth. But Finn was no longer lost. He had found his way home,